name is Billy Wilson. I work for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the Habitat Conservation Planning Branch. Today's lecture is part of the Conservation Lecture Series. You can view the schedule of upcoming lectures, register to attend lectures, or watch videos of past lectures on the website listed on this slide. Okay, sorry. So for here, this list is the schedule of upcoming lectures. As you'll see, we have the tricolored blackbird, the invasive water snakes, the white-nosed syndrome in bats, and the brown water and black swan lectures. For today's lecture, I ask that all audience members please hold your questions until the end. We will pass around a microphone so that those people listening on WebEx can hear your questions. And for those of you on WebEx, we ask that you type your questions into the chat box, and we will read your question off for the presenter at the end as well. So today we are pleased to have Dr. Jeff Villepique presenting a lecture on bighorn sheep. Dr. Villepique is an environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the Inland Desert region, where he works as a wildlife biologist and leads research and management on bighorn sheep in the San Bernardino and San Gabriel Mountains. He began his work with the department in 2001 as a PhD student investigating predator-prey interactions between bighorn sheep and mountain lions in the Sierra Nevada, moving to his current position in Big Bear Lake in 2006. Dr. Villepique completed his doctoral degree at Idaho State University last year. Before coming to California, he completed his master's degree at San Jose State University and master's degree at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He has conducted research on wildlife in New York, Massachusetts, Virginia, Alaska, and California, on taxa including gray fox, gray squirrel, box turtle, black bear, mule deer, mountain lions, and bighorn sheep. His research includes spatial modeling of animal movements using remote sensing to evaluate wildlife habitat relationships and behavioral ecology of predator-prey relationships. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Villepique.
Thank you, Billy, for that introduction, and thanks for coming live and on the web, perhaps. I'd like to thank also Margaret Mansour, who participated in last year's volunteer survey for bighorn sheep we do each year in the San Gabriel Mountains. She heard my talk at the orientation and thought this might be a good topic for a conservation lecture series. Today I'm going to give an overview about bighorn sheep in California, some of the challenges they face, and talk about work in the transverse ranges, and then focus on some work that I've done evaluating how risk of predation influences behavior and resource selection by Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep. The bighorn sheep are sexually dimorphic, with males or rams 30 to 40% heavier than females. Males may weigh up to 100 kilograms or 220 pounds. Females are smaller, weighing about 110, 130 pounds as adults. Like all members of the Bovidae, that cow family, bighorn don't shed their headgear as do members of the deer family. These photos are from the San Gabriel Mountains, where desert, also known as Nelson's bighorn sheep, occur at high elevations in montane habitats. Bighorn sheep, all bighorn sheep, one point I want to get across to all the folks certainly in the department, all bighorn sheep in California are fully protected mammals. That's under Section 4700 of the Fish and Game Code. The other extant subspecies beyond Nelson's, native to California, is the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep, which is a federally endangered taxon, so that's an additional to the status for all bighorn that they're fully protected under state law. Thanks to taxonomic work of Rob Ramey and John Weyhausen, we know that Sierra Nevada bighorn have desert bighorn sheep as their nearest relative. The desert and Sierra subspecies are the only subspecies present in California. They were until December 2014. That's when the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife conducted a translocation of bighorn sheep in the Klamath River Canyon near the California border, and it turns out that a couple of those collared animals moved across the border into California. So where they are today, I don't know, but there's a chance that there's a few bighorn in California, which means they're fully protected, even though those are essentially Rocky Mountain bighorn by the generally accepted taxonomy now. Females and young of Sierra Nevada bighorn, just one picture of that subspecies of sheep native to California. So historically, populations of all bighorn subspecies across North America suffered losses and localized extirpation driven primarily by diseases of domestic livestock, as well as unregulated market hunting. This photo shows a desert bighorn lamb. It's about a week old in the peninsular ranges, and that was down from a gentleman, Jeff Young, took some beautiful photographs that you can find on the Peninsular Bighorn webpage. So the taxonomy and legal status of bighorn in California can be somewhat confusing, or it has been in the past. Remember that all bighorn sheep, again, are fully protected because we've had confusion on that in some projects in the past. However, some populations are also listed as endangered under the ESA, which I'm going to come back to after a brief look at the history and phylogeny of North American sheep. Some examples of rock art depicting sheep can be found in the Mojave Desert. In fact, there are illustrations that also show animals with long tails that can pretty much only be mountain lions. Those were created thousands of years before the present. Going way back, there are 3 recognized subspecies of bighorn sheep native to North America. That's the Rocky Mountain bighorn, which some subdivide the Rocky Mountain bighorn into what's called the California bighorn. That includes Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who say it's what they call California bighorn that came into California. But genetic work, again, Rob Ramey, has pretty much unified the California, what was recognized as a subspecies, with the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. So there are 3 generally accepted subspecies, and that is the Sierra Nevada desert bighorn and the Rocky Mountain bighorn, which we don't have in California, depending on what day it is, and those Klamath River individuals are what they're up to. So collectively, the wild sheep of North America arrived via land bridge during the Pleistocene. They're members of a 3-million-year-old genus of Ovis, which includes Eurasian mouflon and argali. For those interested in phylogenetics and biogeography, there's some really neat molecular studies that provide clues about how the bighorn and thinhorn sheep diverged. So the 2 subspecies of thinhorn sheep that I'm showing kind of up above on that list, that's Ovis dolly. Those are the Dall sheep and stone sheep that are found in Alaska, the Yukon, British Columbia. And they actually split apart a couple 100,000 years ago, according to these molecular studies, in glacial refugia during the last ice age. So it's kind of interesting stuff. The reason I brought this stuff up is it's important to the conservation of bighorn sheep to understand a distant ancestor, and that's the domestic sheep, which, along with the domestic goat, arguably constitute the greatest threats to the conservation of bighorn sheep by virtue of disease. The domestic sheep are historically a major cause of localized extinction, and they remain the greatest threat to the persistence of wild bighorn sheep. Those domestic sheep are the product of 10,000 years, give or take, of domestication. So if an animal could not tolerate a respiratory disease, being in fairly close quarters, it probably died off hundreds or thousands of generations ago. Wild sheep of North America, on the other hand, typically exist in isolated small populations, and they're not subject to those same selective pressures for disease resistance that have affected those domestic sheep. As a result, domestic sheep routinely harbor pathogens that can cause fatal pneumonia in wild bighorn sheep. One way to manage and reduce the risk of transmission from domestics to wild sheep is separation, in space and in time, of grazing allotments from ranges of wild sheep. Well, some guidelines in print specify a buffer of 9 miles. We know that there have been movements of over 30 miles across grazing allotments. And that's been documented by GPS-colored rams in Sierra Nevada. It's important to note it only takes 1 stray domestic sheep or 1 wandering bighorn to carry pathogens that could be brought back to the wild sheep herd and could be fatal to the entire herd. So that's happened over and over and over again. But bighorn sheep, such as these Sierra bighorn, are gregarious, as are domestic sheep. They happily intermix. Sounds happy, but it's a really unfortunate behavioral characteristic that lends itself to the transmission of diseases. Pre-European California was home to now extinct bighorn sheep populations in the north part of the state. This was called the California subspecies, but it's now part of the Rocky Mountain subspecies. Those have gone extinct. There were 2 efforts to restore populations in the north part of the state. Those were short-lived as a result of pneumonia transmitted by domestic sheep. So it's a recurring theme. There was a die-off in 1980 at Lava Beds National Monument in the Siskiyou County, and in 1988 when the Warner Mountains population in Modoc County died off as a result of disease. So outside of the north part of the state, this map provides an overview of sheep populations in California that have suffered localized extinction since the 18th century, essentially since Europeans first came. Spanish had sheep that were run through much of that were driven through wild bighorn habitat with bad results for wild bighorn, for our bighorn sheep. So shown in red are those populations that have gone extinct, and then those in yellow that have been repopulated through our active management efforts. In the past 40 years, bighorn have benefited from restoration efforts by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as cooperating land management agencies, with a great deal of help from volunteer groups like the Society for Conservation of Bighorn Sheep, the Wild Sheep Foundation, and some others as well. So the reestablishment of bighorn sheep is really one of the great successes of North American wildlife management in the 20th century. It continues today in work such as that of the recovery programs for Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep and peninsular bighorn sheep. This is an image from a translocation a few years ago that moved some animals into the Eagle Crags, which is on the China Lake Naval Air Station. Today, we have a reminder of a leading cause for the loss of bighorn sheep populations, past and present, and that's diseases of domestic livestock again. This picture shows a ram with a runny nose, and it's just symptomatic of a respiratory infection. We have a disease outbreak of Mycoplasma ova pneumoniae. It's now impacting Mojave Desert populations in California as well as Nevada, and has affected sheep in Arizona. Fortunately, thus far in California, adult mortality has not been widespread. I'm not going to focus on the ongoing study of the origin or the demographic impact of current disease outbreak. There are better authorities for that, such as Dr. Ben Gonzalez of our Wildlife Investigations Lab, who's far more knowledgeable about disease issues, or another veterinarian in our Will Lab, Dr. Deanna Clifford, who's modeled transmission risk. So there are some other folks that can address those issues better. Remember that the taxonomy of sheep in California include 2 subspecies, Sierra Nevada and desert subspecies. Legally, however, there are 3 distinctions. State fully protected status covers all wild sheep, including the desert bighorn and the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, as well as the transverse ranges. Bighorn occurring in the peninsular ranges were previously taxonomically distinct from desert bighorn sheep, but some molecular analysis showed that those are in fact actually part of the Nelson's or desert bighorn subspecies. However, they are legally designated as a distinct population segment under the Endangered Species Act, so they retain federal endangered status by virtue of that geographic location in the peninsular ranges. So both the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep are recognized both morphologically and genetically as a distinct subspecies, again, most related to desert bighorn. Those also have federal endangered classification. So the one Sierra sheep are a subspecies, they're federally endangered. Peninsular sheep are, they're actually not their own subspecies taxonomically, but legally they're federally endangered. So it's a little bit of a confusing recipe, but the important part is they're all fully protected. 2 populations, those 2 are federally endangered as well. Again, there's some better authorities on the current restoration efforts on the peninsular and Sierra Nevada. Sierra Nevada's Dr. Tom Stevenson, and Randy Bada leads the respective recovery effort for them. As far as we know, this Mycoplasma outbreak that's affected the Mojave population has not spread into the transverse ranges of Southern California. So bighorn sheep are native to the San Gabriel and San Bernardino Mountains, and that's across the east-west, being transverse ranges on the top. I'm not really going to address those peninsular ranges, but what this map shows is those bright green polygons are essentially the bighorn sheep range, and overlaying wildfires that occurred between, there's lots of big fires in 2003. These are fires between 2003 and 2006, and most of these communities are fire-adapted chaparral communities, and wildfire appears to be a key factor in maintaining habitat suitability for those bighorn in the mountain ranges, as well as for things like deer or other species. This is a photo of a mature, what we call a Class 4 ram, which is how you denote the largest age, largest and oldest category of male. It's taken near Mount Baldy in the San Gabriel Mountains. San Gabriel population is of interest because it's got a neat data set that goes back to 1976 when simultaneous winter surveys from the ground and by helicopter were initiated. San Gabriel sheep population dynamics have been the subject of publications by the late Steve Hall, Vern Blake, Steve Torres on a Wildlife Society bulletin paper in 2004. They posited reasons for this large decline to his view from up to over 700 animals in the around 1990. So through actually the peak was in the 80s, but there was quite a decline through the mid to late 1990s, down to perhaps 130 animals in 2000. So numbers are now steadily increasing. We had an estimate of 418 animals inhabiting the range in the last accurate survey, which was 2011 now. Reasons proposed for this decline are several, including increased predation, wherein the decline in mule deer, the primary prey for mountain lion, resulted in prey switching to bighorn. There are also some factors that may have more supporting evidence. Prolonged drought in the absence of fire for long periods in some of these areas. You wind up with closed canopy chaparral. It's not good for forage, and it's not the kind of stuff that sheep typically like to move around in to see risk, predators, how they tend to be in more open areas where visibility is very important. So it's interesting that there's similar trends in numbers affected bighorn sheep in the Sierra Nevada and the peninsular ranges, as well as the transverse ranges, with a parallel decline in deer numbers. So this has brought a lot of attention, such as the 2004 paper there, to how mountain lions might play a role in response to changes in deer numbers and what subsequent impacts they might have on bighorn sheep populations. But finding out what drives these population changes in bighorn is crucial to ensuring the survival of those populations. It's got kind of interesting imagery here. There's a group of bighorn at a bait site that's placed at a defunct mine site at Cattle Canyon. It's in the San Gabriel Mountains near Mount Baldy. Animals were captured at the site and translocated as part of a successful reintroduction effort into the Sespe Wilderness in the Los Padres National Forest. Photos taken during the survey after snow in 2013, which was otherwise dry winter, collared ewe that was taken by one of the volunteers. That's actually a former biologist for the Forest Service, Kathy Meyer, and she'll be leading folks out on the end of this month, February 28th, and March 1st. We're going to do this annual survey. I just wanted to touch on some work by Diane Anderson, who's a graduate student I advised. Diane looked at habitat selection by bighorn sheep at the Cushenberry herd relative to the development of limestone quarries on the north slope of the San Bernardino Mountains. These rams were photographed in the middle of an active mine road by the driver of an 80-ton haul truck, suggesting that they can become habituated to mining activity. Diane evaluated selection relative to different categories of mine-related land covers using data from GPS collars deployed on a small sample of sheep. She likes to play with colors, so this is a preliminary analysis of habitat selection, where values greater than 1 indicate selection use of a resource greater than its availability. Less than 1 represents avoidance, and those are Bonferroni corrected 95% confidence intervals. What it shows is basically bighorn demonstrated neutral selection for mining areas, about 50% more use than we would expect by just random use of the landscape of inactive mines that suggest that reclaimed mines can be preferred habitat for bighorn. There was strong selection for revegetation sites, which the contractors who do plant propagation as part of restoration can confirm that sheep really like it when you water plants and get some new green stuff going. They found that popular. And there was also positive selection for water sources, and it looks like the sheep avoided buffers, but that was really more of a factor of where we buffered all the roads and called that a mine buffer. So it gave a very large area, and the sheep are actually often walking on the road, so that actually needs to get a revision of how the buffers are defined to learn a little bit more. And that'll be broken out in a further iteration. This project should be wrapped up soon, give us some more insights on habitat selection and some responses to mine activities. That's in addition to some work that has been done. Marshall and Blake worked on the same population using pre-GPS data that might have some different kinds of answers. So there's some of the people have done exceptional work over time, the San Bernardino, San Gabriel Mountains, as well as throughout the range of bighorn sheep in California, include Vern Blake, the late Steve Hall, and Steve Torres, pictured here with Rebecca Barboza and myself after Steve netted this ewe in the Peninsular Ranges. I put this in because Steve sent me these pictures last week. I didn't recall. There's an image of Rebecca and Tim Glenner supervising my collection of fecal samples, which is going to provide a segue that foreshadows some of the work I'm going to talk about on diet analysis and investigating relationships between bighorn sheep and risk of predation. So what better way to seek insights into the impacts of predation on bighorn sheep than to evaluate diets of mountain lions by quantifying content of lion feces. In a 2011 paper, we evaluated evidence for prey switching following a decline in mule deer, the primary prey of mountain lions, during a period when Sierra Nevada bighorn reportedly abandoned low elevation winter range in response to risk of predation by mountain lions. So first, it's important, this is a really amazing data set Vern Blake and others have put together for the Eastern Sierra, and John Wayhausen's work tracking the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep. It's kind of a look at historical indexes of prey and predator in the Eastern Sierra. So bighorn sheep, Sierra bighorn sheep are indicated by the blue line. And what we see is they were somewhere above 350 to falling to a low of maybe around 100, so between 1986 and 1995. There's some gaps in these minimum count data due to the difficulty of counting animals in that rugged terrain, particularly from 1987 to 1995. Aggregations at low elevation, where most of the counting took place, were absent. An annual helicopter count of numbers in mule deer in Round Valley, that's that black dashed line, indicated that they dropped from a high of over 6,000 in 1985 all the way down to under 1,000 in 1991, so 84% decline. This is pretty amazing large mammal data that you don't see a whole lot. Now lastly, that red line is an index to the number of mountain lions in a smaller area, but it's in Round Valley, and it's how many collared lions were in a particular polygon on a given day. So it's an index of numbers, and what's really interesting, it looks like there's about an 8-year time lag behind numbers of mule deer, that primary prey. So essentially suggesting that they didn't reproduce, but adults survived maybe for about 8 years of that big lag time. And so that's the question is, well, what's going on during that lag time when there's not enough food? Dr. Wayhausen articulated a hypothesis attributing decreased use of winter range by Sierra Nevada bighorn and the ultimate decline in Sierra bighorn in a 1996 Wildlife Society bulletin publication. In short, under Wayhausen's hypothesis, to avoid high lion predation, documented as 49 lion kills in 11 years, bighorn sheep avoided their low elevation winter range that's traditionally used through the winters. So they lost out on using high quality forage at those low elevations, instead living on low quality forage at high elevation, resulting in poor body condition and lamb recruitment. So it's an interesting question. Mountain lions certainly can cause population level impacts on prey species. Some hypotheses contend that this is most likely when prey switching occurs. So the interpretation's made a bit difficult because the confounding of the factors that may have subjected the population of the primary prey, mule deer, to drop, may also have been directly affecting populations of bighorn sheep to drop. So it's hard to say that it's on the mountain lion. But there are some examples. In Nevada, near extinction of a porcupine population as a result of mountain lion predation coincided with a decline in mule deer. There are some examples from New Mexico and Arizona where increased predation on bighorn sheep by mountain lions also coincided with declines in mule deer populations. So we hypothesized that limited availability of primary prey would result in prey switching during the lag period when mountain lions persisted at high numbers. So perhaps an unprecedented level of predation in mountain lions by mountain lions on Sierra Nevada bighorn led to this range abandonment of more risky, low elevation habitats. So fortunately, Dr. Becky Pierce of the Department of Fish and Wildlife had the foresight to collect about 250 fecal samples from mountain lions, which were from 1991 to 1995, so right after the precipitous drop in mule deer numbers that were analyzed. Turns out, though, we detected seasonal differences, so summer versus winter, in diet composition among mountain lions. Primarily, just mule deer were more frequent in winter than in summer diets, which has been not a new thing in other studies. But we did not detect the hypothesized prey switching. So in our sample, even after this drop of deer population to 25% of its size, there was one bighorn sheep in that sample. And as it turned out, that was a sheep that was killed during the summertime, so it wasn't a winter range kind of thing when those sheep were at high elevation. So it supports the occurrence of bighorn in lion diets. Mountain lions eat bighorn, no one disputes it, but it didn't support this idea that there was some kind of strong prey switching activity going on. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and look at some other experiments. This is manipulative experiments conducted in the White Mountains back in 2004 as part of efforts to understand how bighorn sheep do respond to risk of predation. So I'll give a quick overview of the rationale and talk about the experiment. So understanding how predation affects bighorn populations has a great consequence to conserving these animals. So some natural history information on bighorn sheep is helpful to assess this. So bighorn are habitat specialists, generally select open areas with good visibility. They seldom range far from steep rocky areas in terms of escape terrain. It gives them refuge from coursing predators. Those are coyotes in our areas, wolves in some of the north. And some protection from the stalking hunting mode like mountain lion. Now sheep are again highly gregarious. They benefit from many eyes and ears, and those are adaptive characteristics that decrease the risk of predation. So I'm just going to cruise through a few of these. I've got a little bit more detail than we need to go in, but essentially there's an indirect way of avoiding a predator, which is to not stay around where you're vulnerable, and a direct response to a predator, which is to run, head to escape terrain. In the case of bighorn sheep, some of these others are aggression. Inspection behavior. This means you watch and keep an eye so that your ambush predator can't ambush you. So reducing the chances of encounter. These are just some biological aspects of kind of this indirect predation. So what kinds of things? Lots of eyes and ears, big groups, vigilance, being alert a lot of the time. You don't put your head down and eat all day long if you're a sheep. So, and then when you do detect it, well, they might get to animals in a group, might get into a tighter group, and again, they've diluted the risk that they're the one that's going to be the meal, and flight, right, running away, aggression, even in the case of coyotes. So, from a theoretical point of view, the scale, both in space and time, of a response to risk of predation should be proportionate to the magnitude of the risk. That's what natural selection would tell us. The question of built into that range abandonment hypothesis of Weyhausen, wherein bighorn are posited to trade off safety over food, so they go somewhere safe but there's nothing to eat, and then the population crashes. How is it that could work? Because it doesn't fit Newton's test of an evolutionarily stable strategy. So we identified one mechanism that could provide a link that could make that work. It would be the presence of mountain lion feces. That might be an indicator of elevated predation risk, and that might keep animals out of that low elevation area. So we said if bighorn sheep respond to mountain lions through movement at a landscape scale, the presence of a mountain lion should make bighorn sheep just get out of town, move to higher elevation, move long distances. And in the case of this range abandonment, we're talking thousands of feet vertical, several kilometers. So we were able to do a manipulative experiment. This is in Silver Canyon next to Bishop. There's a road running right through the middle of the canyon. You have year-round use by sheep that are fairly habituated to humans. So we thought that if we introduce sign of mountain lion, we'd see these animals really respond, maybe get out of the canyon bottom, increase their vigilance. So it was something we initially tried to use what's called a giving up density test, which is you put a food tray out and there's an inert substrates that an animal has to dig through, in this case tennis balls, to get to alfalfa pellets. Well, when there's lots of tennis balls and not much alfalfa, you have to work a lot harder. They should leave if there's a risky situation. So it actually didn't work. So if you're having to scrounge for that last alfalfa pellet, you might miss out on other opportunities, mating behavior. So here's what happened, if we can get this to go. Here are sheep after just about a week and a half. They have these feed trays, and they figured out how to just defeat the whole thing that was holding in the tennis balls. Because this guy's got his horn underneath, and he takes the lid off the tray that was keeping the balls from coming right out of the side. So when your best efforts fail, or you break your leg, or both, one response is mine was anyway to build a cannon capable of hurling feces at great distance. So it comes back. So this device used kind of a sabot fashioned from a styrofoam cup to project frozen feces from lions, literally hundreds of meters. It turned out to be pretty unreliable, and so I used a slingshot. If you look at the center of the screen, there's a sheep right on that pile of rocks. That's how we actually delivered lion scat and did these evaluations of foraging to see if behavior of foraging sheep changed. So this was typically 4 or 5 shots is what it took to deliver one lion scat pile. And we did focal animal sampling. There's a little too much detail to go through. But essentially, are they feeding or are they alert? Some other things. And we wanted to see if that really changed. Did they perceive that lion feces as an indicator of risk? We had a couple of GPS-colored animals in there because the initial thought was, hey, they're going to get out of town. So we thought, well, we'd be able to track how far and how soon they came back. So these are fairly large groups sometimes. And here's a photo immediately before delivery with the slingshot. Be careful how I pronounce that word. And just a couple seconds after delivery. And what you see is that they moved a couple feet and the heads are up for a minute. And typically, the response was just for a few seconds, and we didn't have any animal. So a randomly selected animal was used as to look at focal behavior. So everything it does for about 15 minutes. The minimum was 10. So they didn't leave. 5 meters was the max. So here's the result. We got a significant response by bighorn sheep to experimental introduction of lion feces versus control. So it was a greater magnitude, control was horse poop. It was a greater magnitude than the difference from doing nothing, just looking at the behavior, than it was to deliver the lion feces. So they were smelling it hot, essentially. They must have been. So what this suggests is that bighorn sheep used olfaction to perceive risk of mountain lions. They knew something else was up. It wasn't the same as having horse apples hucked at them. And it increased their level of vigilance. However, they didn't respond with some acute flight or abandonment. The resources, that nice food was there in the bottom of the canyon, so they didn't leave that. So this outcome is consistent with visual observations and collar data we have from across the Owens Valley of the Sierra Nevada, where bighorn sheep on several occasions were seen foraging right near where one of their members of their group were actually being fed on by a mountain lion. So it might be that the sheep don't perceive the risk, because if there's a mountain lion, just the presence that a mountain lion had been there might mean it's not a threat. It might be there with a full belly eating your sheep pal, in contrast to the threat of an active hunting lion, which is probably not going to stop and leave a nice scent mark that it's what it's doing there. So the alternative is these bighorn sheep might be using inspection behavior. They're sticking around and trying to assess, because it's safer to know what the enemy's doing than to run away from it. So this is consistent with the notion that the presence of mountain lion feces does not necessarily present risk. I'm going to shift across the way to Sierra Nevada, and the last part I'm going to talk about. Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep, like all subspecies, declined quite a bit. By the 1970s, they were just into 2 ranges in the Sierra, at Mount Baxter and Mount Williamson. And a reintroduction program reestablished herds in historic ranges to the north in the Mono Basin, and Wheeler Ridge, and to Mount Langley, just off the south margin of this map. And I'll talk about Wheeler and Baxter herds in just a minute. But after this successful reintroduction program in the 80s, population declined, and that's that plot of the blue line we saw, down to 125 animals. They were listed as endangered in January 2000. So the decision listing Sierra sheep as endangered included this justification that was the Weyerhaeusen hypothesis. It said that declines in Sierra bighorn resulted from indirect effects of risk of predation by mountain lions. So Weyerhaeusen made a connection between the observed failure of bighorn sheep to use this low elevation range and mountain lions, contending that this behavioral shift in habitat selection was a response to risk of predation. So under this hypothesis, again, sheep are remaining at high elevations through winter, forgoing nutritious growth, grasses, forbs at low elevation, and it resulted in decreased food intake, lower recruitment rate, and then you got also additive stochastic mortality, getting killed in an avalanche or the more extreme weather at those high elevations. So here we have sheep up in the snow, avalanches, severe storms. So for sublethal effects to result in those severe demographic consequences posited by Weyerhaeusen, bighorn sheep must have made a disproportionate trade-off by giving up forage and the relatively mild environment that's down at 3,000 meters or 2,500 meters than up at the tops of mountains that are up to 3,500 meters. So how that apparently maladaptive behavioral response could happen in a co-evolved predator raises some really interesting questions, what unique factors might have been at work, or whether the hypothesis is false and factors other than risk of predation by mountain lions provided a better explanation. So among alternative explanations were a removal for translocation of 103 sheep from the same low elevation range, and then there was the beginning of a 6-year drought. So I looked at this with 2 approaches to understanding the relationship between Sierra Nevada sheep and their primary predator, the mountain lion. So the first was to use a resource selection function using current data to see what do sheep select for. The second was to review some of the data we have from satellite info from the past to try and go back and see what we have. It's a little bit redundant, so we're looking at these different direct mechanisms avoiding predation is staying away from mountain lions. Indirect is staying in some rocky terrain, maybe up to higher elevations. So if resource selection is strongly influenced by this indirect predation risk factors, we should see Sierra bighorn at high elevations, right? Steeper slopes, rugged terrain, all this stuff that makes them a little more less vulnerable, I should say, to mountain lions. So if selection is strongly influenced by the quality of forage, we'd expect bighorn to select for this best forage indexed by NDVI, for solar radiation, and avoiding snow cover. So they'd want to get to the nicer stuff where they can get something to eat at low elevations. So we tested this actually difference in NDVI by evaluating the difference in this NDVI, this vegetation index, at the high elevation and at the low elevations. And I call that like an NDVI trade-off. What's the benefit of going down versus up? And then compared that in wet versus dry years. So we caught a bunch of sheep, 28 individual sheep, 19 female, 9 male, all caught with a net gun. And they're processed to base camp. I just realized I've got a little more information. I don't want to put you to sleep. So they're sampled. We caught a bunch of mountain lions from 2002 to 2009. Either treated them with hounds, caught them on a rock. So that was 24 individuals, 12 male, 12 female. They all get GPS collars. There are actually 39 GPS collars fitted to those lions because we're able to recapture them, catch them again. That one's getting replaced. We actually free-ranged one. That's a different picture, but Becky Pierce managed to shoot a lion with a dart gun to replace the collar. It's a pretty neat trick. Here's a couple of examples of adult mountain lions. The male on the left, one of the largest we caught, about 65 kilos. and then a small, really small female, about 38 kilos. They have marked sexual size dimorphism, just like the bighorn sheep. So they're all fine. People see that photo and think I killed it. I didn't kill it. It's telesol. They're immobilized. So we had 2 study areas we focused on at Wheeler Ridge and at Mount Baxter. And those were defined by composite home ranges from GPS collars on sheep. That's how we verified those data. It was just one midday location a day. Is how we defined their winter range, and that was January through April. We tested for independence of locations, and we actually used this. So what resource selection functions do is look at use versus availability, but by casting random points, and we actually restricted that random available area to 2.4 kilometers. That was based on our movement data for sheep. So that was where an animal is really likely to go. Sometimes they use the whole home ranges in those. This one actually gives what are probable movements. So we evaluated kills from both from GPS collar locations from mountain lions, from collared bighorn sheep, and then we encountered kills of mountain lions by tracking with hounds, often, such as this one was a lamb killed. It's one of our houndsmen. Another investigation of adult bighorn. So we're looking for where were they actually killing bighorn sheep. And we actually made a couple of risk surfaces based on the locations where sheep were killed. And we made another based on the locations where mountain lions were active, so where they're actually moving around. They might lie on a rock for the day, sleeping. That doesn't mean they're hunting there. Or they might be feeding on a kill for days. Unless they're moving, we didn't include those points in there. So it's just active locations. This is some stuff about terrain ruggedness. We looked at escape terrain. It's kind of boring. We looked at some cover types too. We're able to use Imagine to classify some rock cover types. Actually refine some of the vegetation layers. Then we put this stuff all together in the GIS. So we've got topography, snow cover was another one that we were able to do with remote sensing from Landsat data, and then these vegetation indices. So a whole bunch of Landsat data. Fortunately, they turned free in, I guess it was 2008, which is a good deal because it was going to be pretty expensive to do that. So we got the snow cover and then this vegetation index. And what we're doing is fitting a logistic regression model, which sounds kind of boring, but we use all possible combinations of variables. So essentially, we're using what's called an information theoretic approach. We're taking sort of all the possible predictors, putting them together and saying, what does the data show? How does it fit best? Whether these bighorn sheep are going to use where they locate themselves from our GPS collars once a day in the middle of the day, how does that differ from these random points around them? And then we can try to see what is it about that habitat. So when we get through that, this is the information theoretic approach, looking at model averaging, and we weigh by this Aki-Aki information criterion. But again, I'm running a little long on some of this stuff. So, and then we're looking at, so this forage trade-off, we took all the snow-free Landsat images we can get to calculate that NDVI. What's it look up high, like up high? Is there good food there, or is there good food down low? And what's that difference? Is it worth coming down? It's hard to do in a heavy snow year. It turns out it's hard to find high elevation habitat where you can measure something other than snow with the NDVI. So what do we find? Well, there's just one overview is to look at, well, there was a long, at the start of range abandonment in 1987, there was a 6-year drought. So there's one interesting thing. During the period we looked at this resource selection, we actually had one of the driest years on record. We've now passed that, but it was 2002 till the last couple of years. 2005 was the third wettest. We had a lot of variability that maybe has something to do with selection. So here's a picture that illustrates what bighorn sheep do in drought years on top. So we're looking at that snow layer. It's called normalized difference snow index. So what we see is that we look at these daily locations. There's sheep way up at the top of the mountains. And then if we look at the snow year, interestingly, the sheep don't really go in the snow. There are some, they do sometimes in that image. This is Wheeler Ridge. We didn't have these. So this is actually a composite of all the locations of bighorn sheep in green, mountain lions with the red dots in a characteristic drought year. So that was it's 12th of April 2002, with all of the drought year, which was below average precipitation locations of those animals. And then we have 2005, it was a fairly wet year, again, April 12th. Just to give you a little idea what that looks like when you put together where these we're looking for. There's a lot more locations on the dry year slide because we had way more dry years. So there's like 1,300 locations versus 950 on the others. So here's this neat stuff that's the risk surface that we're looking at. What the color ramp is, it's a probability distribution of active mountain lions, so the ones when they're moving. And on top of that, we've got these little Jolly Rogers, skull and crossbones. Those are actually where bighorn sheep were killed. There's another risk surface similar that was done just with those kill locations. So that we had 39 locations where bighorn sheep were killed or cached by mountain lions. And those were close to being correlated, that the sheep kills, but it was, we did allow those into the model. 0.6 was our cutoff, or 0.59. And what it turned out is that, interestingly, the top models predicted for male and female bighorn sheep that both sexes strongly selected for the risk surface from active mountain lions. So it said they were going to the same places that the mountain lions were most active. All the candidate models had selection for the solar radiation index, for steep slopes, things that we sort of knew about sheep, proximity to rugged terrain, little differences in scale, avoidance of snow by females, not so much for males, and then we had some smaller results, but the big one there is that sheep actually went towards mountain lions. So we compared that where that mountain lion distribution was really correlated with elevation. Mountain lions are mostly down at lower elevations, mostly living off bighorn sheep. And it turns out that if you compare the two models, the evidence of selection for bighorn sheep, by bighorn sheep for those areas with active mountain lions was much, much stronger of a model fit. So competing models have this, they call it the delta AIC, this difference of about 4. We're looking at 74 and 124. Males essentially more strongly selecting towards those areas. So that sounds kind of crazy, right? What is going on there? Well, what's not going on there is they didn't get up and leave, bighorn sheep because there were mountain lions active there. No, they kept being sheep and kept using those same areas. Instead, they selected those same areas. And I'm going to come back to why would that be? But one thing, this model validation was pretty high numbers up there. When you're up above 0.9, they're pretty good. And this is across 2 ranges at Wheeler and Baxter. We did one model to try and not overfit something that wouldn't be translatable somewhere else. We did the same modeling for pooling all that data together, even though there's a little bit of different topography. And again, generalized over 6 years, wet years, dry years. Other interesting part, when we looked at this difference from NDVI at high versus low elevations, what we see on the top there, if you just look at NDVI, there's tons of variability. So it was really hard to tell what's going on but when you pool the data within a satellite image rather than across, you put them all together, the highs. If you let's look at one date and time where the atmospheric effects are similar, the things that are going on in your Landsat image, you say what's up high and then what's down low. And we looked at that difference. Now on the bottom, we see a really significant difference in that. And when we look at a wet year, the trade-off going down is way bigger. So there's a lot more going on with the plant growth in a wet year than there is in a drought year. Of course, there's a lot less snow up high during a drought year as well. So essentially, what our modeling shows is that, hey, there's an alternative hypothesis to this. So the hypothesis predicting a strong influence of direct risk of predation, right, going away from mountain lions, that was rejected. Not only did bighorn sheep not avoid areas of mountain lion activity, they selected for those areas where mountain lions were most active. It was one of the strongest predictors. And they also went for slope and ruggedness, those sort of indirect indicators of avoidance and predation risk. The forage availability hypothesis that the sheep are driven by forage, that got some support. That included solar radiation was like one of the strongest predictors, common for both sexes. But this NDVI did not work for us for predicting small-scale movements. We couldn't see the veg essentially among all that granite, and there's some interesting things there. We also had to mask about half of what we're trying to look at as vegetation because it was either snow or a tree. We're looking for forage for the sheep. But when we looked at this trade-off, we just showed from NDVI trade-off, it showed significantly greater forage benefit to migrate to low elevations where predation risk is highest in above-average precipitation years compared with the benefits accrued in lower-than-average precipitation years. So overall, these bottom-up predictors, the habitat, not influences from top-down predation factors, were demonstrated as, I think, a more plausible explanation for past and present patterns of resource selection by Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep. So this work on resource selection, the thing I just talked to you about, is now in press in an open access journal, so no matter what database we may or may not wind up having access to inside the department, you'll be able to see this in Advances in Ecology. It'll be out in the next week or two at the latest. And I just want to thank some of the sources that supported this. There's a whole lot of effort in the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep program and the mountain lion work. So Department of Fish and Wildlife, also these NGOs, Desert Bighorn Council, Cal Deer, Wild Sheep Foundation, and a couple of universities worked with. Probably ran a little bit longer than I, based on my, I guess we're not going too far. I rushed a little bit, so I should have plenty of time for questions. But that's because this was up and running. Okay. I'm looking at a timer that's telling me how long that was up there, not the clock. So if I rushed a little bit, somebody ask me some questions, and we'll go back and look at some of those slides, because I did kind of rush. If anyone has questions, or thank you.
So any questions in the audience? All right. WebEx? Any questions?
I'm going to put everybody to sleep by talking too fast. I'd love to talk about some of those slides or risk surfaces.
All right.
Okay, here's a stupid question for you. Sheep get upset when you were lobbing the scat at them?
They did. So
I mean, just the thing coming at them was surely distressful.
That's a great question, right? So to hear that. Is it distressful to hurl things at foraging sheep? And the answer is yes, it is. And that's why we did this control. So the sheep did react. They foraged less if you threw anything at them versus quietly coming up and watching what they're doing. So that's what we see in this slide. So that's why we did that control with a horse horse species to compare it. So yeah, you're disturbing them, but it's just interesting that the magnitude, it's not a huge change. And so vigilance is just when the head's up, when they're alert and focus sort of, essentially it could be looking for a threat. They're not feeding, they're alert. So yeah, it was, and this is a relatively small sample, but that was statistically significant, under 0.05 p, and this was a, what do we do with that? It's a non-parametric man with the U test, but it was a stronger difference between the mountain lion and the horse stuff than it was if we just looked at like the horse to the nothing. Of course, if you pulled the two, if you said horse and mountain lion, then you actually get a pretty strong effect. You know, stick those two right bars together, the confidence comes down a little. Yes, they do startle. So it would be a fair criticism that that's not a huge sample size, and that could be banded on. But it did give us a statistically significant result that said, hey, maybe there is something to that. You know, that their mode of avoiding predation is to be alert, to look around, but not to give up the food that they need. Anybody else want to see like one of the pretty slides again?
Hi, thank you. I may also have a dumb question. Have you ever considered using like a stuffed or taxidermied mountain lion, stuck it on a rock just to see how far the avoidance distance is?
Absolutely, absolutely. I got down to the point of we have a lion skin in Bishop. I bought some tires at Harbor Freight, and we were trying to figure out how we could convince this thing to quietly move through the brush along that road up there. And it seemed like that just logistically it was going to be really hard to pull that off. So Dan Blumstein's done a lot of this stuff with marmots, and I think it's badgers. I don't know, he does these cool little radio-controlled gadgets, but because there is a fair amount of variation, you got to figure that animals may be figuring it out, getting scared by some artifact of your things on wheels or something like that. It's a really neat idea. The closest we came to make that happen was really, we were thinking the best deal would be someone's trained mountain lion, a captive animal, and having it run up the road to see. And I would agree with you, that would be way more valuable than other than the thrill any primate with a postal thumb gets from throwing feces. But yeah, that would probably be a better approach. I just visited the zoo.
Yeah, I'd be curious how area, even if you stuck one on a rock and left it there for a day or so, how long they would avoid that area.
That's a great question. It gets to how are those sheep perceiving risk, and we think we have examples, and they're kind of anecdotal, but of mountain lion in an area. I don't have a slide, I have other presentations that shows movements of sheep around a center point where a mountain lion just stayed. There's a couple of those, but one classic I have is about 5 days of a mountain lion feeding on a bighorn ram in the Sierra, and we have 3 other GPS-collared sheep that kind of cruise around over those days, and they're within we use the viewshed and the GIS to try and see if, would they be within sort of some kind of detection range. And we have a bunch of different anecdotal examples from the houndsmen that are investigating kills. They go in and investigate a kill, and there's some sheep not too far away staying there. So I suspect, I don't know, it's a great question, that they would figure out that that's not a risk. Probably if you put a stuffed mountain lion, I don't know what they do. They'd look at, or if smell, maybe smell isn't a huge thing, but they'd look at it, get startled and go away. But I think if there was good food down in the canyon, they kept looking at it and went, it's not coming after anybody. It'd be a neat experiment. I have not tried it. Good question.
Okay, we have a question on WebEx. I'm going to read it for you. It comes from Stefan, and he's asking, why can we hunt bighorn if they're all protected in some way?
So that's a great question, too. They are almost all protected. So the fully protected statute, which is Section 4700 of the Fish and Game Code, has an exception that's under Section 4902 that allows for a limited, highly regulated hunt of specifically the Nelson subspecies in areas that are designated as a hunt zone. I think that's under 4901 as to how you could justify a sustainable harvest in there. So it's a highly selective activity, and it ends up, actually, I think it's kind of a neat program. We have drawings for who's able to get that tag, but essentially what the lawyers tell us, the interpretation of 4700 is that all sheep in California are fully protected, except for that one that you drew a tag for, in your 1 in 2,000, 1 in 3,000 odds. But what's cool about that is the hunters that go out and get these trophies, and it's not easy to do. It's not easy to get close to a sheep. They're in some really rugged terrain. They're usually getting the oldest males that are quite likely done breeding. If you shoot a 12-year-old male, ideally they're looking for the really big trophy. They're probably getting beat up by a younger, an 8-year-old male. So at that point, I can't think of anything more sustainable than a harvest of an animal that's pretty soon going to check out of the gene pool. It's probably already checked out of the gene pool, I should say, and it's probably not long, for walking around. And in biology, if you're not reproducing, you're sort of expendable at that point. So that's the rationale in the code. I think it's kind of a neat thing. And we are one of the most California really conservative hunts. There were 13 tags this year. We have somewhere around 5,000 sheep states, so we're extremely conservative. It's one of the reasons that we have a tag each year that's sold at auction for the last 2 years, well upwards of $100,000. So that money goes back into our conservation efforts. If we were hunting bighorn sheep the way some D-zone general deer zones are, we wouldn't have people traveling from other states willing to pay $100,000 and more to hunt them. So that's the rationale. Thanks.
I have a dumb question.
This has been great questions anyway. So.
Is the meat good to eat of these animals? Do they do that or?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're required. You can't waste that kind of game. Any kind of hunted animal. Meat can be really, really delicious. I guess it could be a little tougher on one of those old rams, and I understand that a crock pot fixes that. So they're quite tasty. Maybe a little tough. Really
okay. Thanks.
Good question. All good questions.
Another question, okay.
So I just had a question about deer. So if there are a lot of mule deer around, will the the mountain lion actually just will they just avoid the bighorn sheep, or are they kind of opportunists?
Well, so that's an interesting question, and it's probably I wouldn't say they avoid, and I think it's fair to say that a mountain lion is an opportunist if it happened to be there's an overlap, and that's Wheeler Ridge and this Round Valley deer herd. Some of the deer get up on the foothills of the mountains, at least in a wet year. The sheep typically are down at those lower elevations, so there's overlap. If a mountain lion was hunting mule deer, which is what's keeping them alive for the majority of the winter, and it was 79% of our analysis of diets in the winter were just had mule deer in them, as opposed to other breeding. But if you had a sheep that you just kind of happened into, and you're a mountain lion, I'm pretty sure they would go for it. But it's not that simple. That it's it's probably hard to be opportunistic if you're hunting a specialist that really has these strategies for avoiding predation by getting up on steep, nasty steps in these rocky areas that typically a mule deer is not going to be in. What's interesting, there's work that's been done on mountain lion predation that shows some individuals, a lot of individual variations, they might figure out how to hunt bighorn sheep. So it's one of the tools that's actually been very valuable in the recovery of some of the endangered bighorn sheep populations. When we had intensive monitoring of mountain lions, we actually identified a couple of mountain lions that were repeat offenders that figured out how to kill Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep. And in a couple of instances, there have been several over the years. I was there for 5 years working on the project. We had three, actually. There were 3 within this project, and these 2, 2002 to 2007, they were removed. So they're lethally removed to protect this endangered sheep. So the neat thing about that is by knowing what the individual mountain lions are up to, we're leaving alone the other, the collared animals that I had. There are 24 of them. Three of those animals, and that's a great question because I zipped through those. 3 of them were removed by the project to protect sheep. But the other 21 of them could happily go, and these were all animals that overlapped bighorn sheep range, at least some of the time. That's why they were collared. That's why they're in my analysis. They used those winter ranges. As far as we know, we can't know everything. If we missed a location or a GPS collar failed, for the most part we would know. It's a big piece of prey. Long answer, but there are certainly specialists, and it's one of the things I think is really neat about the information we've been able to gather in the past with a mountain lion monitoring project that really selective targeted removal. We're not talking just predator removal. It's having very solid evidence of guilt of an individual animal. So Good question.
Cool, thank you. Any other questions? All right. Oh.
So you talked a lot about mountain lions, but you also mentioned that coyotes can be predators for bighorn sheep. So how big of an issue are coyotes?
So I think that differs in which habitats we're in. In the Sierra, I'm honestly not familiar if there is a case of coyote predation that's documented. It's probably one because they're really in some super rugged areas. So I shouldn't say there isn't, there is, but it's very, very low compared to some of the other habitats in the Mojave Desert, particularly where there isn't overlap with mule deer, which usually means there's not a mountain lion in the area, but there's coyotes essentially everywhere. Coyotes definitely do prey on bighorn sheep. There's some of the papers on it, Vern Blake and others have written that seeing bighorn used defending their lambs from a coyote, because that's a small enough predator you can gang up and try and kick it. It could be dangerous to a coyote to get a hoof in the game of eating over. So it is an issue in the desert ranges. I don't think it's that big of an issue. It's probably more likely on the young, on lambs. Very low, if any. I'd have to ask some of the folks in this range is probably somewhat sort of an in-between. We're not in the Mojave, but it's a little more.
Expand on Mandy's question. So are they typically going for lambs or older sheep or?
Not typically lambs. And I'm actually not sure the breakdown on male versus female, but essentially mountain lions are capable of taking the largest healthy adults. It's really a different mode of hunting than something like a predator, wolves, for example. They're not running down the prey over miles and, somebody falls behind, weaker, older, or something or other. Mountain lions are kind of stalking up, and they'll take an opportunity they can take, and there's probably not so much selection. Now, Becky Pierce's work has shown that there is selection, like females with young, with kittens, will take more does, more female deer than bucks. Females without kittens are a little more likely to hunt and kill a male deer. So think about it, there's a lower risk if you've got these kittens that you're trying to provision, nurse. If you lose in a battle with, say, a bighorn ram, Becky's work was on deer, though, because samples on, now you've put your whole gene pool of your offspring at risk. Your inclusive fitness really includes your young at that point when you're young. So they're going for more fawns, more females. So it's a pretty interesting question that you get at, some of the collective advantages of different hunting strategies. But as a general rule, a mountain lion can take out those big rams. We've investigated lots of big, mature rams that have been, by all indications, killed by. Good question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for making the trip and your presentation.